And at this time of year, we're pretty familiar with resolutions. We talk about New Year's resolutions, and because New Year's resolutions seem to be things that we can't actually ever do, like the statistics on that are terrible. I mean, if you start looking at New Year's resolution statistics, it's not good. It's not good. So I'll just share a couple with you. Generally, after the first week, we lose about 25% of folks who make New Year's resolutions. They're out. A week later, there's another 4%, so we're at essentially 30% at that point, have already bailed out on resolutions. After 1 month, we're down to about 60%. After 6 months, it's only about 50%. In fact, social scientists have used all of the data that we now give them with our smartwatches that track our exercise habits and all of the different things that we do to figure out when it is that people generally give up on their New Year's resolutions. They call it Quitter's Day. January 19th is Quitter's Day. So I hope you'll join me in celebrating on the 19th. It's Quitter's Day. It's going to be a great day. We'll have church the next day, and we'll maybe recommit to some of the things that we quit the day before. But that's generally the day when people who make New Year's resolutions, they stop going to the gym, they stop working out. It's around January 19th. That's kind of the day that social scientists have pointed at. And some of us have gotten really creative. Because we've done so poorly with New Year's resolutions, now we make goals. Like, my Facebook feed last week was full of people who were like, these are my goals, these are my things, or maybe you chose a word, like, you know, this is my word for the year, this is my intention. Like, all of these things I love. I am a goal-oriented person. I love having kind of some things that I'm working towards, some ideas in my head about where we're going, what we're doing. This is my wheelhouse. I love this stuff. And you've heard me say this, that a goal is a gift that you give yourself for tomorrow. A goal is a gift that you give yourself for tomorrow. It's something that we decide right now, that we do today, that gives us something in the future. 10 years ago, a group of folks in this church set a goal to pay off the debt that we had on the Gibson wing. And now, we get the gift of that. The goal gave us a gift for tomorrow, the next day, in the future. But it begins with a decision. It begins with a decision that we have to make day in and day out, that we have to have a time frame around, that we have to think about, that we have to focus in on. And it begins with Daniel with a decision, with a goal, with a resolution. In the midst of an unsettled time, let's go to the story. In chapter 1, it starts this way. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord let King Jehoiakim of Judah fall into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. These he brought to the lands of Shinar, which is Babylon, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. So let's get kind of a global perspective of what's going on. Assyria has been the dominant global power in that region for quite some time, but the Assyrian Empire is crumbling. A resurgent Egypt is moving north, and Babylon is coming south. And both of these two empires are colliding right around Israel in that moment. Jehoiakim and some of his army ride out to try to get into the battle, and that just doesn't go well. Just doesn't go well. There's this moment of just upheaval in the culture at large. That's what the first few verses of Daniel want us to know, is that things are not as they should be, that things seem upended, that things seem upside down, that the world isn't exactly like they had hoped that it would be. That's the background of Daniel. Can anyone here relate? Right? We all feel that on some level. Like, our world feels like it's just not as firm as it felt just 2 years ago. It seems like when we turn on the news, when we open up our news feed on our phone, there's something new each and every day to upend our world. Little secret, stop watching news. Stop. Right. Our world feels like it's constantly being disrupted. In the midst of disruption, in the midst of uncertainty, we hear the story of Daniel. We hear the story of Daniel being taken with 3 of his friends off to Babylon. Then the king commanded his palace master, Ashpenaz, which is just a great name, you should consider it if you're having a child anytime soon, to bring some of the Israelites of the royal family and the nobility, to bring young men without physical defect, handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace. So Nebuchadnezzar wants the best of the best from all of these places that he's conquered. And it's no different for Israel. He brings them back. He teaches them their ways. And in verse 5 it says this, the king assigned them a daily portion of the royal rations of food and wine. And they were to be educated for 3 years, so that at the end of that time they could be stationed in the king's court. And among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the tribe of Judah. The palace master gave them new names, though. Daniel, he called Belshazzar. Hananiah, he called Shadrach. Mishael, he called Meshach. And Azariah, he called Abednego. Or again, if you're a fan of VeggieTales, Benny. Verse 8, but Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the royal rations of food and wine. So he asked the palace master to allow him to not defile himself. And God had allowed Daniel to receive favor and compassion from the palace master. And the palace master said to Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king. He has appointed your food and your drink, and if he should see that you're in poorer condition than the other young men of your own age, you would endanger my head with the king. Daniel asked the guard, the palace master had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. And you can then compare our appearance with the appearance of the other young men who eat the royal rations, and deal with your servants according to what you observe. So he agreed to this proposal and tested them for 10 days. Now, Daniel resolved. In the midst of the upheaval of the world, Daniel resolved something, not for himself, not because it was about him, not because he needed something that he could hang on to, but because he wanted to glorify God, even in this uncertain moment. This isn't about Daniel doing a fast. This isn't about the popularized version of the Daniel fast. If you want to do that, do that. But that's not what this is about. This isn't about having a better bod. This is about Daniel glorifying God. This is about Daniel hanging firm to the one thing that he knew he could hang firm into in the midst of upheaval. It was about God. It was about God still being good in the midst of it all. Reminds me of the story of Elizabeth Elliott, who was twice widowed. First, by the martyr death of her first husband, Jim Elliott, who was a missionary. He was killed on the field. And then by the death of her second husband, theologian Addison Light. And she talks about how the Apostles' Creed was something that she recited every day as she mourned the loss in her life, as she dealt with the upheaval of this experience. And she used it to remind her of what had not changed in her life. That God was still God, and that God is still good, even when things seem difficult. Daniel and his friends had to wrestle with the same question: what has not changed in the world? And their answer was God. Their answer was God. And they responded in kind. They responded in a way that said, I still want to bring glory to God because God is still God. We're like, well, it was just a diet, right? It's just a diet. What's the big deal? Christopher Wright, a theologian, talks about it in this way. He says, in the ancient world, sharing the food of someone else's table was a way of cementing a covenant bond between the two people. And to eat from the king's table could have been seen as a declaration of total dependence on the king and total loyalty to him. And covenant loyalty to Daniel was exclusively for the God of the universe. They were willing to serve the state under God, but not the state as if it were God. Daniel's values moved into action. And values don't mean a whole lot until they become a part of what we do, until they become behavior that matches. And so Daniel resolved. That's the word that the English translators use. Daniel resolved, as many of us have resolved in the last few weeks, to do this and to do that and to have goals for this year and to do all of these things that we think we need to do and make happen. Daniel resolved not for himself, but Daniel resolved for God's glory. And the word resolved is this compound Hebrew word. The word is shumha. It's really two words put together. It's sham, which is to set down or to fix, and lave, which is heart. Literally, Daniel fixes his heart on what he knows is immovable, unshakable reality. And then everything he does from there on out has behavior to match. He knows what he believes. He knows where he's at. He knows what his values are. And out of that, he begins to make decisions. He set his heart towards God and glorifying God. Putting glory to God, not to him. Because it's easy in that moment to eat the food. It's easy for us to make a decision that says, it's not that big a deal. Daniel, it wasn't about him. It was about God's glory. It was about God's purpose. And purpose isn't purpose until it costs us something. It's easy to eat the food in front of us. It's easy to do the easy thing. That's why it's called the easy thing. Doing the right thing often costs us something. Doing the right thing is often more difficult. Daniel wasn't a vegetarian forever. Daniel didn't just choose vegetables and water because that was a life choice that he was going to have forever. In fact, if we keep reading in the book of Daniel, we see that he does later eat meat. He does later drink wine. But in this moment, he set his heart in such a way that informed all the rest of the decisions that he would make. The book of Daniel rests upon this decision to set his heart for God's glory. And I love what he does. He says to the guard, just 10 days. Just give me 10 days. Which doesn't seem like very much. And maybe that's the point. Mark Batterson wrote a great book called Do It for a Day. And in it, he talks about goals and goal setting, and he talks about how our habits really display what our future is going to be. Or the way Stephen Covey said it, we become what we repeatedly do. Mark Batterson in Do It for a Day says this: the key to any goal is to make it measurable, make it meaningful, and make it maintainable. Make it measurable, make it meaningful, and make it maintainable. And he says if there's a hinge point, it's make it meaningful. It's got to have some meaning. Whatever we do has to have some meaning behind it. It's got to have some larger purpose. We don't just make changes because we want to make changes. It's got to have meaning behind it. It's going to have to cost us something. Most of us, we'd rather have 15 minutes of fame than 50 years of faithfulness. those meaningful decisions. Provide us with those opportunities to be faithful. And sometimes it's not the easy way, it's the more difficult way. In 1947, General Mills introduced instant cake mix. But it didn't really sell very well. When they first introduced it, it didn't sell well at all. It was just add water. What could be easier than cake mix, where you just add water, you mix up the cake, and you make it? Didn't sell. Didn't sell. So they hired a marketing firm to figure out what was going wrong. What they found is that it was too easy. It was too easy. When they asked people, why were you making cakes, and what was it for? It was, we bake cakes for special occasions. It's an expression of love. And such little effort made it seem less meaningful. The cake mix was so simple that it felt self-indulgent. So General Mills set out to make it more meaningful by making it less easy. When consumers had to put eggs and actually measure milk, sales soared. And happy families everywhere got to lick the bowl. The reality is that most of the time, more difficult is better and slower is faster. And are we willing to do the difficult things if they're the right things, to do them God's way? I mean, we could do the easy things. We could eat from the king's table. Would that bring glory to God with our lives? Well, what is it maybe that God is calling you in this year to set your heart to? Maybe it's to really set our heart towards a relationship with God through Jesus, that we've never actually made that decision. Maybe it's to set our heart to have some outward display of an inward invisible faith by being baptized. Maybe it's joining a Bible study. Maybe it's getting in a small group. Maybe it's setting our heart to serve in a certain way. Maybe it's setting your heart to be in worship each week, that you can be there. Maybe it's setting your heart towards a goal that glorifies God, everything that you are.